We will now go to item 9, and this is the overview report for the Drury East private plan change requests. And for the overview report, we will have to the table John Duguid, General Manager of Plans and Places, John Dunshea as well from the Program Office, and Ian Clopper as well, and David Mead. So I think we've got a posse of 4. John, just checking, you won't get to the questions at this point. You will go through your presentation, contributions from all those that you need to have speak to this item that from your management side. And if any questions have been posed in advance, as I invited, I'm not sure what you have received. I did send you something this morning. I'm not sure whether you've seen that, but I will hand over to you in the first instance to introduce the paper, please.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Mayor and Councillors and Member Namani online. So just in response to your questions there, Mr. Chair, yes, we have received some questions from yourself. I haven't seen any others, so can I just ask, did anyone email questions last night? No? That's fine. Okay, so that was the first part. Second part is, yes, our proposal is to run through a presentation, a fairly lengthy presentation in several parts, and then take questions at the end. Okay, right. So I'll start by just giving a bit of an overview of well, setting the scene, I guess, in terms of where these private plan changes for Drury sit relative to Council's overall strategy. The Auckland plan, I'll speak to that briefly. The future urban land supply strategy, I'll reference that. The structure planning that Council did last year and the year before for the Drury area, I'll also mention that. At which point I'll hand over to John Dunshea and Ian Cloppers, who will talk through some of the transport issues in the Drury area and the work that they've been leading along with the Crown and a number of key stakeholders in the area. Then it'll be back to me just to give you a bit of a refresh on the accept, adopt, reject decision-making under the RMA for private plan changes. It's a good 9 months or perhaps even a year or more since we brought any private plan changes to you. Just to let you know that in that 9-month, 12-month period, we have had a number of minor private plan changes that don't raise any significant strategic issues that staff have exercised their delegated authority to accept a number of those. The approach that we are taking with private plan changes is to exercise our delegations where we feel as officers that the plan changes are not testing Council's strategy or policy in any significant way, and that they should be accepted. If staff feel they should be rejected or adopted, we would always bring that to the committee. And for significant issues like the 3 before you today that do raise some strategic issues for the Council, we're certainly always looking to bring those to committee, notwithstanding the fact that we have delegations to accept, adopt or reject private plan changes. So that is the approach that we've discussed with you, Chair, but just advising the other members of the committee. So without further ado...
John, would you like to just introduce David? Because we do have new councillors and new members around the table, and while most of us are familiar with David's work on the Auckland Unitary Plan, if you could just introduce David and why he is the author of the work rather than a planner in-house.
Yeah, so when these 3 private plan changes were lodged as a package together, they have to be dealt with separately under the RMA, hence the 3 reports and 3 sets of decisions that we're seeking from you. At that point in time, we simply didn't have someone with enough seniority and expertise available to manage these private plan changes through the process. So we went out to the market and had Office of Service put in, and David Mead is director at the firm Hill Young Cooper, very experienced planner in the Auckland region and elsewhere, and Helen Cooper's proposal was a successful bid to take on this work. This work is on private plan changes is cost recoverable. We charge all of our actual and reasonable costs back to the applicants, the developers. So David's costs and any other experts that we've had to employ outside of the council and also our own staff time is charged back to the developers for private land changes, and that's allowed under the RMA. So as David made, a lot of experience in this area, and I'm sure a few of you would have met David in the past. So that's David. Right. So just quick recap on the Auckland Plan. Sitting within the Auckland Plan is the development strategy. That's a requirement under the Local Government Auckland Council Act. It's likely to be a requirement, in fact I think it's already a requirement under the National Policy Statement Urban Capacity, and the proposed National Policy Statement Urban Development will also have this requirement to have a development strategy for how Auckland is going to grow over the next 30 or more years. So within the development strategy, we we're sort of looking at a 720,000 increase in population potentially by 2050. That would take Auckland up to 2.4 million. So how and where is the best place to accommodate that increase in population, and where's the best place to look at increase in provision capacity for jobs and employment. So that's sitting in the Auckland Plan Development Strategy. Figure there of around 313,000 additional dwellings, 63,000 jobs. So that was, as you'll be familiar with the Auckland Plan as that went through, those were the sort of forecasts, I think the sort of mid-range forecasts for growth in Auckland over the next, through to 2050. So it's significant. We need a clear understanding, and we need to align the land use, so where the housing and the jobs are going to go, with the provision of infrastructure, and that's all dealt with in the Auckland Plan. And within that development strategy, we have a map that looks like this, that identifies the blue areas are within the existing urban footprint of Auckland. So they're referred to as development areas, where it's anticipated that there will be significant growth within those various areas in the brownfields. And then the sort of the oranges and the yellows are the greenfield areas, the future urban areas within the Auckland Plan, but also within the unitary plan. Those yellow and brown areas, orange areas are identified. They're inside the rural urban boundary in both the Auckland Plan and the unitary plan. But they're currently zoned future urban, which doesn't allow for urban development to take place. So within that context, there are some staging and timeframes that I'll discuss in a second. The other thing about the Auckland Plan, it certainly refers to the city centre and the three major nodes of Albany, Westgate, Manukau as being significant areas for growth. And we'll get on to these future urban areas in a second. So it's about 14,000 hectares of land identified as future urban in both the Auckland Plan and the unitary plan sitting within the urban boundary. So council strategy for growth outside of the existing urban area is to progressively rezone that land, sequence with the provision of bulk infrastructure over various periods of time. So the priority in terms of that sequencing is to sort of build on existing live zoned areas around the fringe of Auckland and areas with less physical constraints. Those were some of the drivers for the timing of when those future urban areas would be rezoned and the provision infrastructure provided in the way of bulk infrastructure. So if we take the particular case study here of Drury, so these are the timings that I referred to that all of the future urban areas have, and you'll see within the Drury Opaheki area here, and on the map here. If I start with the sort of darker area there, that's the May development, the Aoranga Charles Marr development there. That land is now live zoned by way of private plan changes by Charles Marr and Aoranga. So that's a live zoned area there. So it says future urban area 2018. It's already gone from being future urban to being urban. Oh, apologies. So that's the area here. We've also got Drury South, which is a light and I think some heavy industrial land there. The Stevenson's quarry land, which has a live zoning of industrial. Also to the south of that, there is a special housing area that's now live zoned as residential, classic homes development in the south there. So if we look closer to where we're discussing today, so I'll just, for the first time, I'll sort of point out roughly where the private plan changes that are before you sit. They're in that, we call that Drury East. It's east of State Highway 1. So State Highway 1 running up here. That's the main trunk rail line running through here. So the private plan changes are generally in that area there, but we'll have some slides that get more into specifics of that shortly. But if we discuss the timing again, that orange area there is development ready from 2022. Development ready means live zone, so it would no longer be future urban, and the bulk infrastructure would be in place. So the Auckland plan indicates that that orange area to the west of the Auranga development there would be development ready from 2022. That doesn't mean bang on 2022, but sort of in a fairly short time frame from 2022, the Auckland plan was signalling that the area in the west would be live zoned with the provision of bulk infrastructure. But getting back to the east again, the timing there is 2028 to 2022. So these colours are a little bit difficult to pick up, but it's that colour there. So Auckland plan and also the future urban land supply strategy that I'll talk about that really dovetails in with the Auckland plan shows the area of these private plan changes as being development ready from between 2028 and 2032. Now we're obviously in 2020, so hence the strategic issue that's resulted in us bringing these plan changes before you, and we'll get into that whole issue of the timing and sequencing shortly with the subsequent presentations. But just making that clear that we're sort of eight or so years ahead of when the Auckland plan and the future urban land supply strategy had signalled that these areas would be development ready with the bulk infrastructure in place. So as I mentioned, so supporting the Auckland plan and just adopted by Council prior to the Auckland plan was the future urban land supply strategy that really there was a lot of work undertaken by Council and the CCOs to identify a logical sequencing of when these future urban areas would be provided with the bulk infrastructure and when they should be live zoned from future urban to urban. So adopted in 2017 in July, was signalling that clearly we can't afford 14,000 or more hectares of rural land to become urban overnight and provided with all of the bulk infrastructure, which is into the billions and billions of dollars worth. There needs to be logical sequencing, and also if all of that land was to be developed at haste in a shorter period of time than the sort of 30-year signal in the future urban land supply strategy, then our whole compact city approach could be undermined as well. We'd start seeing more greenfield peripheral development and less urban development around centres and transport nodes. So it's all about getting that balance right between brownfields and greenfields, with the Auckland plan signalling predominantly brownfields, but this future urban land supply providing for, say, 30 to 40% of Auckland's growth over the next 30 or so years. So a diagram there just illustrating in an ideal world, so on the top line we've got what we call the planning process. This is from the future urban land supply strategy, so there'd be some high-level planning building off the Auckland plan. Then we get into structure planning, which we've done in the Drury-Opaheki area, and then there will be some plan changes that end up with the land being live zone. So that's the top line there. High level sort of planning that's been done for this area. The structure planning has been done, but Council certainly hasn't initiated any plan changes because we're still ahead of that 2028 date. And then in terms of planning and delivery of infrastructure, I guess the planning and design phase should be occurring when your high level work is being undertaken there. Then we move into sort of consenting and designations for the bulk infrastructure, and then the build. So that's a sort of ideal scenario, so that your bulk infrastructure, your key public transport routes, infrastructure, your roading infrastructure, your bulk water supply, wastewater, and so on, ideally is in place at the same time as the land is live zoned. It's never as straightforward as that. It doesn't necessarily need to be absolutely as perfectly aligned as that, and John and Ian can discuss in a bit more detail some of that alignment issue in terms of transport infrastructure. So, talked about the Auckland plan, future urban land supply strategy. So structure planning is something that the unitary plan signals must be undertaken before land that's future urban becomes urban. So we've, as council, we've now prepared structure plans for Warkworth in the north, the Silverdale West business land, Drury Obaheki, Whanuapai, and Pukekohe Pairata. So probably roughly close to 3/4 of all of that future urban land now has a structure plan, and certainly this area here, the Drury area, has a structure plan that was adopted last year. So it was earlier this year. I should know the answer to that. Fairly recently. September last year. So this is what a structure plan does. It's not statutory, it's not binding on developers, it's not binding on the council. It really just takes looks at these future urban areas, looks at what the ideal mix of land uses should be, where should the higher density housing areas be, the lower density housing areas, the no-go areas in terms of constraints like flooding and hazards and cultural heritage and so on. And it looks at it explores aligning the land use with the infrastructure provision, not just transport, but also looking at water, stormwater, community facilities, and some central government infrastructure, things like schools and hospitals and so on were also considered as part of the Drury structure plan exercise. So we did a lot of work with the government in developing the structure plan and key landowners, stakeholders, iwi, to develop these structure plans. And they are essentially a precursor to then designing, developing and getting the bulk infrastructure consented, and also rezoning the land through the unitary plan. Now, just because we have a structure plan for the entire Drury Obaheki area, when we weren't signalling as council that would mean that the land would be rezoned and the bulk infrastructure would be in place sooner than the Auckland plan. And the structure plan for Drury Obaheki essentially just refers back to the timing and staging in the Auckland plan, the future urban land supply. It didn't adjust anything. It did make a note that some issues are under review in terms of timing and staging, but it didn't change anything in terms of that, the dates in the Auckland plan and falls. So southern structure plans here, we ran 2 structure plans in parallel. We did as council, we did the Drury Obaheki structure plan and we did the Pukekohe Pairata structure plan at the same time. Different communities, different engagement, different structure plans at the end of the day, but they ran concurrently through the engagement process and through the council technical work and adoption. And as I mentioned, they didn't adjust any of the timings, but they did note that various things were happening to explore whether there could be a revised timing, whether that might make sense. So that's just the 2 structure plan areas. Just a couple more slides from me. We have, so this is the future urban zoned land in the Auckland unitary plan. This was the area that was subject to the structure planning. We're starting to show here the 2 of the 3 private plan changes that are before you on the east. We also have, this is the Auranga development here that has been live zoned. You'll see it's no longer yellow. It's gone to a mix of a small centre here, some medium density housing and some standard sort of suburban housing. That's the Auranga development. The hatched areas here, or the stippled areas, they have now been rezoned. They are Auranga as well. So they went through a private plan change process 2 or 3 years ago through the committee. But today we are primarily discussing the issues on the eastern side of State Highway 1 here. Just a bit of context, Papakura Centre there, State Highway 1, the main trunk rail line, Transpower's National Grid line runs through this area. We have the small Drury Township here. Sorry, Drury Township is up there. Got that wrong. And State Highway 22, Karaka Road, heading south to Pukekohe. Councils work very closely with AT and NZTA under the Te Tupu Ngātahi Supporting Growth Alliance as we did the structure planning exercise. So there is a very close alignment between the council adopted structure plan for this area and the work that the Alliance has been undertaking, and there are ongoing discussions between council staff, AT, NZTA, around the specifics of these key transport routes for both public and private vehicle use and walking and cycling. So that is the end product of all of that structure planning exercise, as adopted by Council in September last year. We have a structure plan for the entire future urban area of Drury-Oberheki, notwithstanding the staging issue that I've mentioned. On the east, it shows a large centre here, which is generally aligned with one of the private plan changes before you today, which is the Kiwi Income private plan change. We have some medium to high density housing around that, and then some more conventional suburban housing here, and that's us moving up beyond the private plan change area. So that's where the 3 private plan changes sit. And as we'll discuss shortly, they are generally aligned with the land use shown in the council structure plan, i.e. large centre here, medium to higher density housing here, and perhaps more conventional suburban housing as you head out from State Highway 1. So what does this all mean? What does the structure plan sort of mean in terms of overall yields or the amount of housing and employment? So in terms of estimated population in that entire area, 50,000 people, 21,600 dwellings within the residential areas, within the centres, the town centres and local centres, another 400 houses, and maybe a population of about 1,000. Estimated number of jobs, 4,500 in the sort of commercial centres, in the industrial and business areas, 3,800. So total number of jobs about 12,000, population total about 60,000, 22,000 dwellings. So it's a significant portion of Auckland's growth is signalled to occur in these areas through the Auckland plan and through the council's own structure plan. So this isn't just the private plan changes areas to be clear, this is the entire structure plan area. So that's the overview from me in terms of Auckland Plan Full's structure planning. At this point, I'd like to hand over to John and Ian to talk about the transport work that's been happening.
Thanks, John. Morning, Chair, morning, councillors. Just a brief introduction. The Drury, it should be, I suppose, transport infrastructure development program. So the focus of this piece of work was transport infrastructure. So with the structure plan adopted in August, September of 2019, and with the likelihood of private plan changes pending, the Crown and the Council agreed that a joint program of work between the Crown and the Council would be undertaken. Those involved were Auckland Council, Auckland Transport, Supporting Growth Alliance, New Zealand Transport Authority, Ministry of Transport, Kiwi Rail, Treasury, Crown Infrastructure Partners, particularly on the funding side, and also the Infrastructure Commission. The purpose of this work, which was started in June last year, was firstly to look at and resolve the existing significant capacity and safety issues in the transport system serving Drury, and then as to think about these what was required to support the existing enabled development capacity in Drury West, and look to enable the potential urbanisation of Drury, of land both to the west and east of State Highway 1. And a fundamental principle in terms of the work we did was that we would start with a public transport-led approach. So a full transport network-led approach, building a public transport network. So what we looked at was the optimal staging, sequencing, timing for delivering the preferred transport network and associated public transport services. That included the staging and sequencing of projects, planning, delivery and construction scope for each project, and the dependencies and independencies of each project. And so we work closely with Supporting Growth Alliance, NZTA and AT on that, and Ian Kloppers to my right led a large part of that work. Having done that and considered what infrastructure was needed, how it should be sequenced and where it should be provided, we then were required to look at what were the options for funding and financing the required infrastructure. And that included specifically looking at whether or not an infrastructure funding and financing levy using new legislation would be appropriate or indeed required. And again, as part of this work, the consideration was given to whether or not it would be appropriate to bring forward any of the land holdings to the east of State Highway 1. And then it was intended that the Mayor and Ministry of Transport would be given clear advice and reasoning on the preferred options for the transport network at Drury. Just going back in terms of sort of the context, and I've touched on some of this already, the work commenced in 2019. We provided, in doing the work, we looked at a number of scenarios. So the first scenario we looked at was what we called the base case. So this was our best estimation of how the network should be, the full network should be sequenced and phased. And that was undertaken prior to the announcement of the NZ Up package. The NZ Up package was then announced in January 2020. And that provided $2.4 billion of funding for 5 major transport infrastructure projects, which were significant bulk infrastructure projects comprised and required as part of the transport network for Drury. So following that, we then did an additional, we looked at an additional 4 scenarios using the NZ Up projects as a base case, and considering what additional infrastructure was required in order to support those that investment and those projects to enable a full network approach to the development of Drury with a public transport-led approach. It's worth emphasising at this point that what we were doing was looking at a full network. So it was everything we're looking at here is a full build out. So a lot of the images and the numbers you will see are what are required for a full build out of a public transport or a transport network for Drury. And as such, the cost, whether it be P50 or P90, is the same for whatever option. The difference was how you staged and sequenced that infrastructure over time. So the options allow for different spend profiles over time, with higher or lower spend in each decade, and the options considered dependencies between projects and constructability of the infrastructure. Now, there's a lot of numbers on this slide. I suppose the first thing, is that how it works? Just push this. Yes. So the first thing I'd ask you to look is that first column, which is the base case. So that was the one that was done prior to the announcement of the NZ Up package. And then I'd ask you to look at the bottom line, which is the total cost, which you'll see is the same regardless of which of the options you take. And against each of the 5 options, we've got a P50 and a P95 estimate, which just relates to degree of certainty of accuracy of costings. I suppose the most fundamental thing to take in here, apart from the overall cost, remembering that these figures include the 2.4 billion provided by NZ Up, is that when you move from, say, P50 in the base case to P50 in the comprehensive scenario, in decade one, there is a significant increase, as there is in each of those 4 NZ Up inclusive options. And then if you go down to decade two, you'll see that the spend in decade two drops. So the point to take from that slide, apart from the overall costs, is the fact that what the NZ Up package did was bring forward a significant amount of spend from the second decade into the first decade. So moving on, and here's a slide that's, I'm sorry, not very legible. And really there are just some key things that you can take out of it would be the green projects are the projects that would be funded by NZ Up. And they include at least 2 of the railway stations, the northern or central railway station and the western railway station. And then Parata stations down there. That wasn't initially part of the NZ Up package, but there are discussions going on about how that could be brought forward as well. The blue roads are those identified that by AT, SGA and ourselves as being required to support that investment. And the blue ones are the ones that need to come forward in the first and second decade. And then the gold one is the infrastructure package or the roading that would be needed in the second or third decade. So again, I'd emphasise that this is a network required to support the development of both sides of State Highway 1 over a period of 30 years. And that is a full build out. The other thing it's worth referencing here is one of the outcomes of the work we did was that you soon realised that it wasn't efficient to build half a road. So if you were going to build out a transport network, it was difficult to just build half a road to serve one part and not do the other half. From a cost efficiency and financing and funding point of view, it was far more efficient to build a complete road which might actually serve a wider area. The next slide is broken down into the actual projects themselves. So the brown is the projects funded by NZ Up, and you can see the projects themselves there, and you can see the costs. The blue projects that are funded by NZTA and the Crown, that's Parata Station and full tracking, and you'll see that the full tracking is a significant cost and likely to be at least a second decade cost. State Highway 22 improvements would be a National Land Transport Fund cost. And then the balance, the yellow, which is about 1.9 billion, is the roading infrastructure that would be required to support the NZ Up investment, and which would require additional funding from some other source. Now, again, I'm sorry if this is a bit confusing, but what we tried to do was actually link the colours. But I suppose the key things that you need to look at there in terms of our work was the fact that excluding NZ Up, the total transport investment required was 2.9 billion. So there was 2.9 billion required to provide the supporting infrastructure to provide a public transport-led network of transport to support the development of the whole of Drury. the council's share of that, if you take out the NZTA 50%, is about 600 million. And then there was additional infrastructure, which is a high-level estimate, but we've looked at that further, and we're fairly confident with those, is that additional investment would be required from the Crown of 500 million, which is made up of stormwater infrastructure of approximately 200 and parks and community facilities of 300, bringing the total investment required from other sources, well, more particularly the council, of about $1 billion. Now, we then needed to look at how that $1 billion might be funded in order to support that network. And there are a variety of options available for supporting that, which are highlighted here on the slide. I think, again, a key point to take here is the fact that what we have in particular in the council at the moment is a financing problem. So we've got a debt to revenue issue, and so our ability to do what we would normally do and use development contributions is constrained because the provision of infrastructure and collection of development contributions don't align necessarily. There's a lag, and you end up having to borrow in order to put in the infrastructure and then recover the money through DCs. So we're left with a situation where we have to look at alternative ways of how we might finance this infrastructure or finance and fund it in the medium term at least, short to medium term at least, and one of the options for that was infrastructure financing and funding levy. So we looked at that option, and yes, there is the possibility that we could use an infrastructure financing and funding levy. The levels would probably be unattractive to developers, and I don't think either the Mayor or the Minister would like to set any levy like at the levels that were first suggested, and the levels that are proposed at the moment would be in the region, if we use that tool, would be in the region of $1,000 to $1,500, which is what's been used elsewhere in Auckland and Milldale, which was the first development where a levy was used. So that's one tool that we can use. ATAP and the LTP is possibly another tool that could be explored, though that is constrained. Crown, we're not sure whether or not there is any alternative funding there, but again, I mean, I'll just leave that as we're not sure. LTP, we know what the issues with the LTP are at the moment. IFF, I've talked about. DCs and IGCs, so IGCs will be used, and at some stage there is the potential that development contributions will be able to be used, because the time frame for this development is long, and hopefully we will move through our financing constraints and be in a position where we may be able to borrow and use DCs as we normally would. And then the other option we're looking at in terms of bridging that gap is contributions from developers. And that could be through a direct contribution for paying for particular pieces of infrastructure, or there could be some infrastructure financing or infrastructure funding agreement reached where either financial contributions could be made as well if they didn't provide the infrastructure themselves. So what we have is now, and just in summation, we have NZ funding of $2.4 billion. We've got unconfirmed funding, of which our share is about $1 billion. We've got a structure plan in place. We've got rezoning and plan changes being considered. What we need to do now is integrate those plan changes with infrastructure and its financing and funding. And that is the work that is being undertaken now. So as a result of the work we've done and looking at all the options and the best options and identifying that the whole of the public transport or of the transport network plus stormwater and community facilities at least would require an additional $1 billion funding. It was agreed with, between the Mayor and the Minister, or the Crown and the Council, that work would be done with the developers to understand how they would be able to contribute to the funding of the necessary infrastructure to fill that gap. And that isn't, and so that work has commenced. So we are working with all of the eastern developers and also some of the western developers like Charles Marr, who already has a development in place. And it is worth just emphasising that that isn't a simple exercise of just saying how much is this piece of infrastructure going to cost and what is your share. It actually has to take into account timing as well and benefit. So in assessing what share of a developer should pay, you need to see what impact they would have on the network and what is considered to be their fair contribution to that impact, what benefits they get from the infrastructure, and also when that infrastructure will be provided. So some of that infrastructure may not need to be provided for some years. It could be 5+ years, it could be 10+ years in terms of when that infrastructure needs to be provided. And we will work through the developers analysing what infrastructure is required, when it's required, where it's required, and what share the developers are able to pay, and where there are any other sources of funding that might be available. And that's where we are with it at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Back to John Dugan.
Right, okay, so just 2 more segments to go and then in time for your questions. But we did feel it was very important to give you the full picture, the full overview, starting with the strategic, getting into the transport work. The decisions you're being asked to make today are under the Resource Management Act, and we believe that all of the matters that we're discussing are relevant to your decision, but ultimately your decision is constrained by what you can and can't consider under the RMA. So that's what I'm going to talk to now, and then I'll hand over to David Mead to talk to the 3 specific plan changes and our overall recommendations today. So you've had a similar presentation to this about 6, 8, 9 months ago. So just to recap, the private plan change process under the Resource Management Act, anyone can lodge a request with council for a change to the unitary plan, any change whatsoever to the unitary plan, from the most absurd through to the most amazing, minor, very significant. Anything's potentially up for a private plan change request that could affect all of Auckland under the unitary plan, but most of the time it's very site or area specific. It's usually a landowner seeking some changes to enable some form of development that isn't easily obtained under the unitary plan as it stands. We have to acknowledge the request. We did that quite some time ago for these 3. We sought further information from the applicants over a period of time to get all of the details that we felt that council requires to make a decision. We didn't ask that the plan changes were modified to any significant extent that I can recall, David.
Well, we had some discussions.
Yeah, there were quite a few discussions over quite a few months and around what modifications might be made to the plan changes to make them more, I guess, acceptable. Then we have to make a decision within a statutory time frame which ends in about 2 weeks' time. So we're saying essentially we have to make a decision, council really has to make a decision today, to either adopt the requests, which basically means the council is saying we really strongly support this plan change. It's something that council would have done if we'd thought about it or had the time or resource to do it. Then you might adopt it. And when you adopt it, you take over all of the costs. So as I mentioned previously, we can continue recovering our costs from the applicants if a decision is made to accept them, right through to the council final decision on these plan changes after a hearing. We can recover all of those costs, including the cost of the hearing. But if you adopt a private plan change, you're essentially taking it on as council with council costs, covering the costs. If you accept the private plan changes today, you're essentially allowing them to go out for submissions. So they are publicly notified. They would go out for submissions, and then it goes into the normal RMA process of we summarise those submissions, we publish that, people can make a further submission to support or oppose something someone else asked for. Then there's a hearing, and then there is a decision on the plan changes, private plan changes at that point. If the private plan changes are rejected, the RMA, sorry, I'll get onto that in a second. So there are four options: adopt, accept, or reject. Or council could somehow convert them into a resource consent application, but the scale and complexity of these private plan changes is very different to a resource consent application, so that's really not an option for council. Number 4, it really is adopt, accept, or reject are the three primary choices that you have. If council rejects a private plan change request, so if you were to reject them today, they can then appeal to the Environment Court and try and get that decision overturned. Council can, of course, turn up at the Environment Court with evidence and legal arguments as to why it made that decision, but just to point out that any decision to reject can be appealed to the Environment Court, and then we have to advise the 3 applicants in this case of our decision. They're potentially watching online and in the room here today. They may have a consultant here, so I'm sure they'll be aware of the decision today. It's in the open agenda. So then if accepted or adopted, the council then publicly notifies the request, as I mentioned before. It goes out for submissions. Number 7 there, the council can actually make a submission on private plan changes. So if council feels there are still some issues to be resolved, and that's certainly the case for these 3, as identified in the report, so there are some significant issues that staff and David as our consultant believes still need to be worked through, then council can also make a submission, as can our CCOs. And as mentioned in the report, Auckland Transport have signalled that they are looking to make a submission if these private plan changes are adopted or accepted. Hearing commissioners appointed in the normal way by the regulatory committee. Elected members can be appointed if they have the RMA Commissioner certification to be part of a hearings panel for private plan changes. Council must hold a hearing if there are submitters who want to be heard, and then council, through its independent or hearing commissioners, makes a decision on the private plan change requests after a hearing. And then that decision, which would be made if these private plan changes are accepted in somewhere between probably 9 months and a year's time, would be appealable to the Environment Court. So the specific part of the RMA is called Clause 25. You'll see that mentioned in the agenda report. So Clause 25 requires us to make a decision within 30 working days of receiving the request and all of the information. So we're now heading towards that. We've doubled that 30 working days to 60 working days, which we can do under the RMA. So we're now at the point that a decision has to be made, as I mentioned, and it's that adopt, accept. C really isn't an option, as we speak to in the report, or reject. So just a little bit about rejecting private plan changes. As you've heard before, the bar is set pretty high for a reject. A, the request has to be frivolous or vexatious. And sorry, the council may reject. The council is not required to reject a private plan change on any of these grounds. But the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, do any of these grounds apply? And if they do, then you go on to make the decision whether you feel it's necessary to reject or not. So I guess it's an option for council. It's not mandatory that you reject on any of these grounds. But is it frivolous or vexatious? Has the substance of the request, has council already considered this issue within the last 2 years? Is it not in accordance with sound resource management practice? Is C. Would it make the unitary plan inconsistent with Part 5 of the RMA, the sort of sustainable purpose of the RMA? Or E, has this part of the entry plan been operative for less than 2 years? And just a little note at the end there, I've mentioned it already, if one or more of these grounds apply, you then have the discretion, you do have the ability to reject, but you're not required to reject a private plan change. So frivolous and vexatious, the case law, just clarify that means that something's, if it's frivolous, it's trivial, doesn't have any substance, no real merit. Vexatious, it's really someone through a private plan change looking to do something to frustrate a process or cause financial cost to someone else who might be affected by it. Timing of the private plan changes within the last 2 years. Has the substance of the request been considered? Or has the plan change been operative for less than 2 years? And here's just a little bit of case law around, and it should be not in accordance with sound resource management practice. So there's a leading case there, which was in Auckland, Rodney District Council, Mallory Corporation Limited, where the court was saying, and we've got that in quotes there, sound resource management practice is not defined or used in the RMA, but it's not specifically defined or used anywhere else in the RMA. It is used in Clause 25. There's no definitive answer to what constitutes sound resource management practice. However, if it's to be given any meaning, the court was saying that it needs to be tied to the purpose of the sustainable management purpose of the RMA. An assessment should be limited to a course scale assessment. So at this stage in the process, the court was saying councils shouldn't be diving into the absolute detail of the plan changes. It's a broad course assessment of their merits. That detailed assessment takes place if they're accepted or adopted and go out for submissions. And those are that's the key case law there around resource management practice, sound resource management practice. So the last part of our presentation, just to wrap it all up, is handing over to David, who will talk briefly to each of the 3 private plan changes and explain his conclusions and recommendations. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, John. So we'll proceed with, the plan was to proceed with David now. Now, no members, this is quite lengthy and dense, but the intention is to keep travelling on this journey, and we'll hear from David now, and then we will take those questions. David.
Right, thanks. Maybe if I just, or do you want to operate the pointer? No? Okay, cool. So yes, there's 3 plan changes. They're all separate plan changes, obviously, but in their preparation, the requesters have been working together, and they do share a lot of the common, analysis across the, especially transport issues and stormwater and things like that. But we've got to treat, each as a separate plan change. In terms of that sort of context, John's covered a lot of this already. Obviously, the red box is where the 3 combined plan change areas is, over there. I guess a couple of other points that are worth mentioning in terms of sort of the natural environment. Probably the critical issues is the, the areas, the stormwater they drain to the Drury Creek area. There are significant ecological areas at that top part of the creek there in the estuary area. So there's issues there around stormwater management, of course, and contaminant reduction, things like that needs to be looked at. There's land to the north which will develop at some point. That's at the moment time for subsequent decades. There's big issues there around flooding which need to be resolved, but at some point there will be a future residential community up there which also want to connect through to the area and the activities and the transport that's going to be provided. The Bremner Road area too, on the opposite side of the highway, that probably also has a relationship with people living in that area. They'll probably want to get across to the train station that's going to go in there, those sort of things. So those sort of connectivity issues are quite important too. The zoning pattern, as John's mentioned, this is the 3 combined areas. Follows pretty closely to what the structure plan looked at. There's a metropolitan centre zone proposed in this area, and then wrapped around that a mixed use zone. And then spilling out from that further out, terrace housing and apartment building zoning, mixed housing urban and mixed housing suburban. So you get that sort of graduation of density away from what seemed to be the core area that would develop up around the current Drury business and township area. The new centre, obviously got the motorway corridor coming through, Great South Road, and crucially, of course, the rail line through there too. There'd be a small neighbourhood centre further to the, I guess, the sort of southern area, will provide a sort of neighbourhood function for that community that are probably outside the walkable catchment that would come through from this new centre. So just a little bit more detail on the individual plan changes themselves. This is the Jury Central, the Kiwi property plan change. As I said, the key feature, I guess, is this proposal for a metropolitan centre zone over about 35 hectares. They're talking about having a sort of a Main Street form or sort of provisions which promote a Main Street form to that centre. There's also be a large format component though, the large big box retails and also mixed uses, residential and commercial and office and that sort of thing. The mixed use would provide also that scope for residential and business. The mixed use is sort of seen to be quite a flexible zoning which could be, go either way, accommodate quite a development area. And then there's open space zoning proposed alongside the Hingaya stream. In terms of sort of the some of the key sort of built form features that may come through, building heights obviously is something that's been promoted. Area A, which would be sort of close to where the rail line is, the sort of core of the centre. Current metropolitan zoning has a 72-metre high building limit in it. They've suggested or requested that that be carried through to this area here. And I guess it provides that sort of long-term capacity. Away from that, it starts to spill down heights in terms of building heights as it goes towards more of those residential areas. In terms of precinct plan provisions, they've provided a precinct plan which indicates a proposed roading network through the area. This would be the sort of the main street, that blue line. Some sort of civic plaza area. They've indicated a train station as part of their precinct plan on land owned currently by Watercare. Where that train station actually ends up at the end of the day, that's a decision that AET and Kiwi Rail are going to have to work through, and it may well be in a different location, but I mean similar location, but not exactly in that area. So there's obviously plan provisions which talk about these sort of collector type roads being provided as part of the development. There's also some provisions which talk about some sort of thresholds or triggers about the need to upgrade Waihoihoi Road and Great South Road intersection as development is staged. Obviously issues to do with sort of immediate safety sort of upgrades, pedestrians, cyclists, that sort of thing, at some point looking to turn that into a signalised intersection. In terms of the Jury East plan change, so this is Fulton Hogan, obviously the Kiwi property one's just to the left there, follows the zoning pattern suggested in the structure plan, that mixed housing urban. Oh, sorry, that's a mixed housing urban. The TAB zone, which allows for that sort of apartment type development. Mixed housing urban, mixed housing suburban, so you've got that graduation of density going out. And then again, provisions which talk about, I guess the key one is a sort of a central sort of boulevard or key connector sort of road running through the middle of the development area. That's obviously Mill Road. Final alignment need to be sorted out. Waihoihoi Road there. I guess what's not shown in here is also important feature is there is a stream corridor that runs through the whole of the site, sort of in a sort of general east-west direction. Sort of nominally called the Fitzgerald Stream, and that could be seen to be quite a key sort of green corridor, linking element through that area. Final one, Waihoihoi, it's the smaller one of the three. It's across Waihoihoi Road, so that's Kiwi property in here, across the road here. They've shown terrace houses and apartment building zoning, which is consistent with their structure plan because of its proximity to that future centre, train station, those sort of issues. The precinct plan will show two sub-areas. The main issue to the north is there's a large floodplain, the Slippery Creek floodplain, and so the northern part of it, which drains to that floodplain, would have some sort of coverage control, some sort of issues around stormwater management there. In terms of sort of the plan provisions, they show a linking road through here, and this is the north-south, Opaheki north-south route, which intends to carry on further to the north and provide that connectivity to that future environment, future community to the north. So that's the sort of brief overview of the three plan changes. In terms of my recommendation, the recommendation is that the three plan changes get accepted for that next step of submissions and hearing. Yeah, the recommendation is not to adopt them, and I think John's covered off that issues why. It's not appropriate to adopt them in this case. The plan change, do you treat the plan changes as resource consent? Well, obviously the scale of them is huge and way beyond what a resource consent would ever sort of deal with. And then you look at those sort of issues to do with the rejection arguments. Is it frivolous or vexatious? Well, clearly not. I mean, there's lots of detailed work's gone into them. Have they been considered previously in the last 2 years and rejected by the council? You might look back to the Falls, future urban land supply strategy and say, well, there seems to be a timing issue there. But again, there's nothing in the Falls strategy which indicates a sort of a hard line saying, no, this should not occur for the next whatever period. So there's no obvious decision point there about where these have been considered previously and said, no, these can't happen. Then you move through to the more complex ones, I guess, which is the Sound Resource Management Act 1 and the Part 5 of the RMA. And the Part 5 is really about that sort of flow through from national policy, regional policy down. Is it going to make the plan inconsistent with those bigger, higher order documents? Gets a bit more sort of complex at this point, but I think with the stuff that has been now come through from the NZ Up, and the commitment to the train station, the rail upgrade, those sort of critical parts of that sort of infrastructure, especially that sort of public transport first sort of approach, I think it provides enough support for these plan changes to say, yes, they should go through to this next stage, which is the submission stage and the hearing stage. And that detailed sort of merits-based assessment that will then have to occur of the plan provisions and the issues to do with infrastructure, funding and timing. So there's still things to be addressed with these plan changes. Doesn't mean going through this sort of first gateway means they get a home run and that's all, easy work from here on in. I think there's a range of issues that need to be sorted out through this merits-based approach around the train station location, obviously, connectivity to it, the streams, stormwater, funding issues. But I think in terms of that first hurdle, as John said, it's a very high bar. It's a course merits assessment. It's really there to chuck out something which has got no hope, in my view. If there's a sort of issues to be resolved, then the case law is saying, well, the best approach is to say, well, let's put it through the detailed merits-based assessment process. Thank you.
Thank you, David. John, do you have anything further to add at that conclusion?
That concludes our presentation.
Okay. So, members, there was an invitation to lodge questions in advance. I think they were mine, but I think there's something from Councillor Dalton that might have just come in, and then we'll go to others. So, John, can I just read those questions out? So my first question that I lodged with you this morning is, would staff provide examples of plan changes being progressed, either public or private, that is our own, or private, where the proposed land use development is not integrated with infrastructure provision, particularly in this case, transport infrastructure? Do we have previous examples?
If we start with the Drury area, we have at least, I think 3 by last count, additional private plan changes lodged in the Drury Future Urban Area, but they were lodged much more recently than the 3 that you're dealing with today, or that we're dealing with today. So there is a new private plan change by Maid, or Charles Marr in the west, building on his existing live zoned, or their existing live zoned area. Further up Great South Road towards Papakura, but still within the future urban area, there is a a smaller private plan change, and that's Drury East, but north of the three that we're looking at today. Stevenson's who have the quarry in Drury, they have lodged a private plan change request in this area as well to go from live zoned light industrial to mixed use, and that does generate a different level of impacts on traffic and so on as well. So there are a number in this area that we're in that process of asking them to provide further information before we can make a decision to, or the council can make a decision to accept, adopt or reject those. So there are a few that raise similar issues in this Drury area. We did notify a plan change for Whanuapai, so that was a council-led plan change for Whanuapai, where some of the transport funding and delivery issues were still not completely resolved, so not all of the funding was in place. And that issue did come up at the hearing, and the hearing has been adjourned. And Chair, I know that you're a commissioner on that hearing, so that we probably can't go into detail, and probably don't need to, but just to recognise that there was a council-led plan change in a future urban area in Whanuapai, notified over 2 years ago now, where some but not all of the transport funding issues were resolved at that point in time. But I guess we've moved on a bit since then, and we certainly have a lot more detail about the Drury situation than perhaps we had for Whanuapai, and with pressures around council budget and so on, we're certainly getting sharper and sharper in understanding these funding and infrastructures more and more as time goes by. But those are the only ones that I can think of at this stage. Mr. Chair.
Okay, look, my second question was about the implications of transport funding for the balance of Auckland if the infrastructure funding and financing agreements or other sources of funding are not agreed with by the private plan change proposer, that they don't fully cover those complementary, the complementary transport infrastructure, which essentially is that $600 million number. So would that? So what are the implications, and would this lead to a skewing of future investment? In some ways, as we saw following the confirmation of the special housing areas, where infrastructure funding was only identified as either likely or unlikely. Is there a risk of skewing the investment requirement for the balance of Auckland?
So, Mr. Chair, we've all seen your questions in advance, and so the next 3 of your 5 questions will be dealt with by John and Ian, because they are primarily, as you've said, around the funding of the infrastructure and the infrastructure issue. And I think the last question, I'm going to hand over to David Mead, who's got a response to that. So over to you, John.
So I'll start and then let Ian come in. So the answer is yes, it might. And the reason being that, as we've seen, there's the impact, funnily enough, of an additional $2.4 billion worth of funding being provided by the Crown to provide bulk infrastructure has been to bring forward supporting spend by a decade of requiring an additional $1 billion. So, as I've said, we're working with the Crown to negotiate with the developers around how they might fund their share of that, and that could be through an infrastructure financing funding levy or some other infrastructure funding agreement. And as I've said, that isn't a binary or black and white thing, because there's also another thing in there, which is timing and the length of time that this will take, and some of this infrastructure may not need to be provided for some years or funded for some years. But assuming that we couldn't reach agreement with the developers on meeting the balance of that funding, or if the funding was required sooner rather than later, then yes, that would potentially mean that money would have to be invested in Drury that might not be invested and might not be able to be invested elsewhere. Ian, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I think you covered it, John.
Okay.
Did you say you had the other questions there, John? Or?
Yeah. Your third question. So again, this is one for John and Ian.
I think the third question has been covered in the presentation, which I did not see when I wrote the question, but I've now seen the presentation. And time being of the essence, can we go to the question about the fourth question and then the fifth, John?
So the Mill Road question, we're not aware of any, we weren't aware of any specific request for the Crown to bring forward Mill Road by a decade. In inquiries following your question, I think there have been general discussions around parts of Mill Road amongst a list of other things that might have gone to the Crown at some stage, but we weren't aware of any specific request for the Crown to bring forward that, and as staff it was a surprise to us that happened.
So there was no consideration of the consequential transport infrastructure funding demands when Mill Road was recommended to be brought forward?
The NZ Up program was not something that was that we were aware was coming forward in the way it did. That's all I can say.
Okay, and look, my last question is just about, is there any precedent risk here in, so this is identified in the Auckland Plan Development Strategy and the Future Urban Land Supply Strategy for sequenced release in 2028, it's now 2020. Is there any risk and precedent-setting risk here, John?
I think, well, maybe David can start, and if need be,
Yeah,
I
okay,
can
thanks.
comment as well. Yeah.
Well, I guess each plan change request as they come forward needs to be assessed on its own merits. Is there a precedent? I think in this case, to my mind, the NZ Up funding, especially around the commitment around the train station and the electrification, they seem to me to be critical infrastructure components in this case, and that whole sort of transit-orientated development idea is really important. And I think with the commitment coming through from the government to those two critical pieces of infrastructure, I think there is a distinction that can be drawn between other areas that may or may not come forward compared to this one.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Dalton, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I've really supported the process of the jury structure planning, the integrated process, but my questions are a little similar to yours, Councillor. I'm looking at the first report, so item 9, and so there is assumptions in there about what will be funded, and so I have 3 things. One, I appreciate the leverage and the opportunity from the Crown funding. My concern is around the prioritisation when we have existing degrading assets, and what the report I'm looking at, and the others will be the same, is that there is a commitment from Auckland Transport, and so we're assuming Auckland Transport will deliver new and upgraded arterial road connections, point 11, that they will upgrade Waihoehoe Road and Great South Road, and that will need to be done to be able to support the new infrastructure, but where within our long-term plan, asking the Chair of Finance now, is that priority against existing need? Because we have existing need. And the third thing is around the population projections. So bearing in mind the conversations we're having around water for population, you've talked about the stormwater, which is of incredible concern, and it needs to be funded. Have we got the population projections right? Because I was hearing yesterday that could be variable. And so do we know what that need is in terms of infrastructure, and how are we going to fund it when we already have existing assets that need to be renewed? Thank you.
I suppose part of my answer will be a planning answer in a way. So the first part of it is that is the exercise that we are undertaking now with the developers, supported by the Crown, to understanding what infrastructure is required, when and where, how much it might cost, and what the who will pay what share, and then that will have implications potentially for the council and how it might finance or fund the infrastructure. But the second part of my question, or my answer, is down to that process is then intended to inform the hearing that will take place if these plan changes were approved for notification. So all that work would be undertaken and presented to the hearings panel, and then the hearings panel will then consider whether or not the necessary infrastructure to support development was able to be funded and therefore provided, and then put restrictions or constraints about what might be developed prior to land use being confirmed. But you know, I'd ask either David or John to confirm that that's how they see, from a planning point of view, it would work.
Councillor Dalton and members of the committee. So we have signalled in the reports that it may well be wise for council to make a submission on these plan changes to keep these funding and infrastructure issues very much before the hearings panel. We know that Auckland Transport are going to make a submission on the transport funding issues, so that when we get to a hearing, if these issues aren't satisfactorily resolved, either through agreements or other means, then it's potentially the situation may be that the plan changes fail when they get to a hearing, and they could still be declined at a hearing if these significant issues aren't resolved through the various funding means and mechanisms that John described in that presentation. So we're saying that this is a step in a process where we feel there's not enough in it to go down the reject path, but we think these funding and infrastructure issues are still very much need to be resolved by the time we get to a hearing. And so, yeah, I think it's work that's ongoing. It's a significant piece of work that these developers and others and the Crown are involved in, and will need to stay involved. Otherwise, potentially when we get to a hearing, they may not pass the test at that point.
So my supplementary to you is that it's for me, where I sit, it's quite a difficult decision, knowing the budgets, knowing the next 10-year plan, knowing the condition of existing assets, knowing we need the growth, hoping that we as a council and finance and Auckland Transport will present the information that the hearings panel, independent hearings panel, will need to assess whether Auckland Council, Auckland Transport, Healthy Waters, Watercare can support the developments, the plan changes. That seems to me that the options in my mind are either accept or reject, but there's no good reason to reject, so there's an accept on the hope that we can continue to fund the infrastructure for the rest of the city as well as a new development, unless there's an alternative funding model. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. And look, good testing questions, and I'm sure we're all asking in our own minds, mindful of a challenging budget and in the very near future and immediate future challenges. Look, can I just help then in that regard by putting forward what you see in the red? So we know that Auckland Transport will be submitting, and there is the opportunity for a submission to come through this planning committee as well to represent the wider Auckland Council view. So I'll park that there, and then I'll go to Councillor Newman, please.
Good morning. I have a series of questions. So my first question I think I should direct to you, John. Would you agree with me that with respect to the future urban land supply strategy, or FULS, with the best will in the world, we can have that, but it's a non-statutory document. It doesn't preclude applications coming in to go ahead of that sequence, and that we would have to address applications out of sequence through a resource management process. And in effect, that means that we have to deal not only with this, but we could be dealing with a multitude of applications out of sequence. That's the first question.
Yes, I'd agree. We certainly feel the FULS is a really critical document for council to have got its own thinking around what a logical, sensible sequencing of rezoning and infrastructure provision would be in these greenfield areas over the next 2.5, 3 decades. So we certainly support the need for having a falls. It signals to landowners in that area and others that that is the logical, sensible sequence. But as you've mentioned, Councillor Newman, under the RMA, it's not binding on council, it's not binding on applicants, it's not binding on the Environment Court for anything that might end up in the Environment Court. It's not binding on hearing commissioners. It's something that they can take into account or consider, but the real tests or the real criteria are those that we've run through today in the presentation around the 2-year time frame, the contrary to Part 5 of the RMA, the not in accordance with sound resource management practice. And sound resource management practice is essentially embodied in the falls, so you can sort of indirectly reference the falls in any arguments in support or opposition to private plan changes. But the short answer is no, it's not statutory, so we can only give it so much weight, and it's the real issues around funding, financing. Those are relevant under the RMA, they're relevant under sound resource management practice, but the falls itself is not directly relevant. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So, I mean, this morning I'll be voting to accept this. I just want to return to paragraph 16 and item 9 now. It says the private plan change requesters have stated that they are willing to develop a funding agreement. I bet they are. They will want a funding agreement where the agreement will be ultimately to shift as much of the cost from their balance sheet onto ours. Any funding agreement actually needs to do the other thing. It needs to be off our balance sheet onto theirs. The trick will be the cost of the delivery of the infrastructure, because my expectation here would be, as you time the delivery of the infrastructure, if it was timed up front, the full benefits and the attributed cause to require that infrastructure falls on the requester, and they have to pay for it. But over time, as you delay the delivery of infrastructure and it's developed in the future, the cause and the benefits received start to be dispersed amongst many groups, not just the requester. So how do we ensure that we encapsulate a funding agreement that allocates the cost to causation and benefits received, as opposed to in 10, 15 years' time we would deliver infrastructure and they'll say, well, actually, there's this whole great big group of New Zealanders who live here now, they should pay for it, not us. We might have agreed something up front, but the situation's changed. So it's not going to be us now, it's going to be everybody. How do we ensure that we price the cost back to those who trigger the cost in the first place?
Yeah, Chair, Councillor, I think that's part of the process we're currently engaging with the developers. Obviously, as you correctly said, there's a cost or a infrastructure that benefits the current proposers, and the same infrastructure will benefit a wider area. As part of the DTIP work, we did a beneficiary analysis of the whole region, the whole structure plan area, whereby we use causation as a reason for the infrastructure, as well as what we refer to a origin, start and origin. And from that point of view, as you correctly says, it will probably come down to doing part of the infrastructure, and the fact that we have done the DTIP work and the full build-out work, we have a good understanding of what the relationships between the different infrastructure is, and the fact that we can rescale some of the infrastructure, like a Waiawi Road, for instance, in this regard. So it's very possible to, and that's part of the process that we are busy with engaging with the developers at this stage, is to see what is fair and equitable in terms of what their development require, and if their development at this stage require a certain scale or scope of infrastructure. Once again, with reference to Waiawi, the expectation would be that they would pay for that. And in future, and the eastern part of the area is probably the more difficult part, given the Opaiki, the flat issues we have there. But the assumption from Fulls and from the structure plan is that there will be development in the future there, and a wider or an upgraded Waiawi from a 2-liner to a 4-liner will probably benefit those beneficiaries more than the current proposers. So that's part of the process, and obviously in the run up to the or lead up to the possible hearing, those are the, I guess, the engagements and the answers we would like to come to is how do we stagger this infrastructure, and how do we ensure that the initial proposers pay for what benefit they get from initial infrastructure.
One more questions, Chair, if you don't mind, please. I anticipated you might have said that, and I'm not comfortable with it, obviously, because it will just come down to a never-ending arm wrestle around the allocation of costs to reflect causation and benefits received. I've seen this argument before. At paragraph 53, we're talking about, so I kind of feel like even in your report, we're already getting down to a debate around triaging some of these, I think, quite critical projects if you're going to fully deliver this proper, this new city. And we're talking about, in terms of the benefits of the growth area projects to the unfunded projects or longer term projects, and may or may not be justified upon detailed examination. See, I think those projects here are absolutely fundamental, and I think there are other projects that are fundamental which aren't even included. For example, grade separation at Opeki Road and at Sutton Road, but that's not included here. So I know that we're starting to get into the weeds of what would be a debate for a hearing, but already in your covering reports, I'm seeing gaps, and I'm also seeing signals as to, well, we're just going to have to start to wind back or possibly not look at some of these because upon detailed examination they weren't actually justified. I think they are justified. I think it starts to get down to quite a binary thing. Either this happens or it doesn't. What I don't want to do is what we normally do, which is, okay, we want to do it, but we can't afford it, so we're going to have to wind back. And I say that because this is in one of the least resilient parts of Auckland in terms of its stormwater coverage. There's a lot of flooding in this area. This is a floodplain. This flows into a harbour, which is a low energy location. So there are all sorts of issues with respect to land use and consequences on marine environment. There's very poor transport linkages in this area. I'm looking at people like Councillor Coombe over there, and she has every right to be concerned, as I'm sure she is. There are very significant challenges in terms of walking and cycling, PT. This is going to require enormous investments in terms of roading infrastructure. Electrification and 2 train stations ain't going to cut it. So how do I get certainty that we're going to be able to deliver the necessary transport infrastructure to start, as opposed to let's start by accepting this, but negotiate away things that I think are pretty fundamental?
Chair, Councillor, I think all the points you've raised is very valid, and that's part of the process going forward is to get down to that level of detail. At this stage, obviously we've done the full build-out view, and that's what we've presented this morning. To get from the full build-out view to what's required, as John also referred to earlier, in terms of the actual scoping, the staging, the timing of when the infrastructure is required is the level of detail that we will be getting to in the lead up to a possible hearing. So at this stage, you've got a full build-out view. Fully agree with your comments. Definite concern. We don't have the answers to those questions at this stage.
But we are in a position where probably a better position here than we have been in many other structure plans in terms of at least a year, and probably more if you take into account the work that SGA have done around ATAP and things like that, and identifying what the key transport infrastructure is. In terms of stormwater, yes, we understand that there is a stormwater issue here, and we've been discussing that with the Healthy Waters team, and we understand that there will be a considerable amount of work there. In terms of being able to definitively sit here and say that we are going to be able to capture all of that now here, we don't think we can do that. And yes, you are right. There will be an element of negotiation in that, but that negotiation will then feed into the hearings process, and which and Councillor, you'll be familiar with that, and the evidence we put before them.
Well, I'm not going to, I'll just finish off, Chair, by saying this. Takanini is 50 years old and it doesn't have grade separation for a 50-year-old suburb. And I am looking at a report which contains planning that will drive funding worth well in excess of $1 billion. And I'm already seeing gaps. So thank you for your reports, and I look forward to the council evidence in the event this is accepted for a hearing.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. Look, I appreciate the comments, and we've had questions to date. Look, it's always, I should have probably moved it, so I'll move it. Do I have a second for this? Councillor Cooper. Sorry, can I just... Councillor Cashmore? Okay, thank you. Seconded, Councillor Cashmore. He put his foot down. Now we can take questions and comments. So further questions, Councillor Cooper? No, I was... okay, Councillor Coombe?
Thank you, Mr Chair. Kia ora koutou. I did appreciate all the scene setting and the work that's gone into that presentation, especially as a new councillor not having been involved in any of this leading up to these reports. I guess my question goes to, there's been various strands of my question, and Councillor Newman is absolutely right that this is something that's top of mind. I just wondered in terms of, I appreciate the wheels on this are very much churning, the momentum is all underway, and I can see through the RMA process there are various points at which things can be looked at in more detail. But I just wondered, stepping back in terms of our development strategy and growth approach, is there at any point that in this post-COVID world, climate crisis bearing down on us, that we actually have some sense check points where we step back and look at it in terms of holistically, are we taking the right steps forward? And I just wondered if there is any point in that process, or if that's outside of the RMA process, but whether as a council we need to actually, I'm calling it a sense check, but it's probably absolutely more of a, we're boxing on in one direction based on assumptions that are now coming up to a decade old. So where do you see that happening, and does it need to happen, and is it outside of this process? Thank you.
Through the chair, the big challenge there, I guess, is that we have an Auckland plan that's not a decade old, it's 2 years old, and it identified these areas as future urban, albeit the timing of this area in the east was 2028, not 2020 or 2022 by the time these plan changes might get through a process if they succeed ultimately at a hearing. So, we do have to be mindful of this. This is a decision under the RMA, as you pointed out, and I guess our key RMA document, the Unitary Plan, signals this area as future urban, as does the Auckland Plan. So, but your broader question, step back from all of that, should the council be having a bit of a review of its overall growth strategy? That's work that could potentially commence. We've always signalled whenever the Auckland Plan goes through, and with the future urban land supply strategy as well, that they will be reviewed from time to time. So I don't know, probably over to Megan as Chief of Strategy to comment on what thinking within the organisation is happening around those strategic issues and when that might come to committee. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Councillor. Look, we will need in this post-COVID world to review some of this. So the answer is yes. I don't have a time frame for you, but we'll do some more work on that and we'll come back to you as a group.
Thank you, Councillor Coombe. Councillor Simpson, please.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Look, I just wondered whether you and the Deputy Mayor would consider a slight amendment to B. I wasn't going to say anything, but seeing you've noted that, of course, that is the challenge that we have, I was going to add, note Auckland Transport intend to make a submission on the private plan changes in relation to the challenges associated with Trent, because, transport infrastructure and delivery. It could be anything, but it's the challenges associated with them that are the key points, in my opinion. It's not just any.
Look, I'm happy to amend. I think it's assumed in the motion.
Never assume. Never assume.
If we don't understand that, then we probably wouldn't be writing the motion. But John, is this your area? Challenges? Sorry, John Dunshea or Ian. Challenges associated with transport infrastructure funding and delivery issues?
Gee, I don't have a strong view on it. I mean, there are challenges associated with transport infrastructure funding and delivery,
What about water, wastewater?
yes, and I agree there are. I mean, it's I'm not making a submission to Raplange in relation to transport infrastructure funding and delivery.
So we're only dealing at the moment with B, which relates to Auckland Transport, and the matters that Councillor Newman addresses would come in, I think, under the report back under C.
Speaking out loud, I mean, as it initially was drafted, it just is a submission. We don't know what the tenor of the submission would be in terms of, and I suppose that makes it more explicit about the fact that there are foreseen as challenges. But anybody else got any? No.
Through the chair, I look, it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, look, if we just want to wordsmith it that way, we'll just put that in there. And anything further, Councillor Simpson? Anything further? I've got Mayor Goff and then back to Councillor Newman. Mayor Goff.
I've got a comment.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chair. Look, obviously, with the government throwing $2.3 billion into this, we're not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. This is $2.3 billion that we wouldn't have had in another development. So clearly, that will influence our thinking. My three questions are these. First of all, you mentioned in the introduction about only 2 stations, which I think are Drury West and Drury Central. I've been advised by the Chief Executive of NZTA, Nicole Rosie, that now encompasses the full cost of the 3rd station at Pirata. I just wanted to know whether you've been advised of that, because that's what I've been saying, including to ministers, and it would be nice to know that you've been formally advised of that. Through the Chair, Mayor Phil, I'm not sure that we've been formally advised, unless you've been formally advised, Ian, but that is our understanding, is the fact that, yes, there is a lot of work going on about the 3 stations, and I have had discussions with Kiwi Rail about 3 stations, but I'm not sure that any of us have been formally advised. Yeah, well, it came from Brett Glidden in the presence of Nicole Rosie, so I'm assuming that we can make that assumption, but it'd really be nice to lock that in. I've tried to lock it in with ministers. The second question is, I think in our discussions you've talked about these private plan changes being about 80% consistent with our current structure plan. And obviously what we want to do in our submissions is to bring that as close as possible to fully compliant with our structure plans. Given your experience in this area, what assumptions can we make about the chances of getting those changes that are needed? You probably can't make any assumptions with commissioners or the Environment Court, but what's your feeling about it?
Thank you, Mayor Phil. It really comes down to the case that we put forward as council at a hearing. So where we put forward, really good expert evidence backed by a really strong expert, and potentially in this case legal submissions as well at the hearing, that will stand us in good stead for getting those changes through. It'll obviously be up to the commissioners, as you pointed out, to weigh up our arguments versus any arguments from the developers. But I guess once the developers, if accepted, see our submissions, there's always a chance that they go into the hearing and modify their position as well to get that gap, the 80% up to 90 or 100%. But it comes down to the strength of our case at the hearing. Past experience is that if we go in with really good expertise, we've got a really good shot at getting what we seek as council in a submission. If we go in just with a lightweight submission, that's not a good approach. So we will have to invest strongly in a submission if the committee endorses a submission. Yep.
Thank you. My last question is, the difficulty is, while we might have surplus money under ATAP because the government has now agreed to pay fully for what we were going to pay a share for, such as Mill Road, that's a decade out, and we are going to have some real challenges in being able to fund the associated infrastructure costs that might fall on us. If the private plans go forward and we actually can't meet the cost of our share of the infrastructure, what happens then?
Phil, so if they go forward through being accepted today, and it's tested at the hearing, there's still a chance at the hearing that they won't.
Sorry, I mean,
if they are
let me
ultimately
just clarify. If the hearing commissioners approve the changes involving infrastructure costs for council that we're not able to meet, what is the consequences of that?
Right, so it's a topic we haven't discussed today. We thought it was maybe getting into a bit more detail, but one mechanism that district plans and the unitary plan use in Auckland and elsewhere is a thing called a trigger, so that the area gets the zoning in place. It goes from future urban to residential or business or whatever it might be, but there is a clause, a rule that goes alongside that says that you only get the benefit of that zoning change when the infrastructure is in place. And therefore, the applicant would have to apply to breach that rule and try and run the argument that it's acceptable to do so. So we can put triggers in place, but they're not absolutely bulletproof, and so there is still some residual risk there. But that is one mechanism that we'd certainly be looking at, making sure. And I think the plan changes as currently lodged have some of those triggers in there, but we've said in the report we certainly don't believe those triggers go nearly far enough or are as strong enough, but there is that safeguard there. If all of that fails and that the triggers are there, but someone's able to get a resource consent to breach that rule in the plan and gets a non-complying or a discretionary resource consent to go ahead with a resource consent, I guess at that point you're looking at, in terms of transport issues, a suboptimal outcome. You would be getting development taking place before the infrastructure is there, and that's certainly the worst case scenario. We'd like to try and make sure we absolutely avoid that at all cost. Yeah.
Can I just say, Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for the work that you did. I thought your presentation was very full, very thorough, very helpful, and I support the recommendations.
Thank you, Mayor. Just following up on the Mayor's question, though, there's one other avenue, though, isn't there? And particularly if council was a submitter, it has the right of appeal.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. In terms of non-transport infrastructure, for example, water and wastewater, if there's still some outstanding issues there, then Watercare can, outside of the RMA, refuse a connection if the infrastructure doesn't have the capacity and hasn't been upgraded. So it's, but yes, back to your point, absolutely, council could appeal the decision if we didn't feel the strict triggers were strong enough, or if we felt that the infrastructure issues just simply hadn't been satisfactorily resolved by the hearings panel. We can appeal to the Environment Court that decision if we are a submitter on the plan change.
Right, and to be clear, you need to be a submitter. This is not just the machinery of the regulatory team responding to the private plan change. You would have to be a submitter.
We would really need to be a submitter.
Okay, yeah. That's why the C is there, members, to cover, I think, a lot of the concern that's been raised. Back to Councillor Newman.
Just a follow-up from me, and can I just premise this by saying I think there's a real risk that we have to rely on infrastructure triggers, and that would be a very bad outcome if it got to that point, because in effect you're requiring the infrastructure providers to in effect be a veto, because our budgetary situation doesn't provide for good planning outcomes. I think there is fraught with risks. I'm sure that you would agree with that. But just at paragraph 98, you reference Watercare. I just want to check with you what discussions, if any, have taken place to lead to an officer agreement with Veolia. This actually is within the Veolia franchise. So Veolia do the retail water and wastewater infrastructure in this particular location, Watercare do the main headworks, but this is actually Veolia. And secondly, Veolia's franchise agreement and their funding plan, they actually there's a real concern as to whether they can actually fund, that they can charge infrastructure growth charges to the developers. They are funding their assets based on the capital they have from charging their customers, which is next to nothing in the scheme of what's required here. So what discussions have taken place with Veolia to inform them as to what they're going to do?
I can't comment here on what discussions have taken place with Veolia, though all I can explain is that the Watercare, and that maybe because they have had discussions with Veolia have undertaken works which have enabled wastewater to be provided to Drury South Limited, and that then the other developers to the east would be able to benefit from that bulk wastewater provision that have been provided to Drury South Limited, and that incorporates pumping stations, I think, at Fitzgerald Road and then on Charles Marr's site, and Charles Marr benefits from that as well. And that a bulk water supply has been provided to Flanagan Road, I think, and that Drury South Limited have provided, as a developer mitigation, the necessary connections to that, and that each of the eastern developers will need to provide their own connections to that Flanagan water connection at the appropriate time. And Watercare are satisfied that the wastewater and water issues or supply for those eastern developers is under control. And whether or not that's because they have had discussions with Veolia and have come to an arrangement, I'm not sure. That's all I can tell you. Okay.
My one final question, then, with indulgence, Chair. There is a concern here that we get the same situation that occurred in Hangaia. We don't have the ability to enable development within a live zoned area because there is latent capacity which has been absorbed by a developer. What's the risk here? That we have some capacity that's developed for bulk water and wastewater supply, but the capacity is gobbled up because these developers, if they're paying for it, will want assurance that they have that connection when they want it, but they're only a minority within this development area. There's a much bigger group of landowners within Drury that might want to come in later and say, I'm here, I'm ready to go now. Might even be at the time that we have the future land suppliers going to have them connecting up, and they will want to take the latent capacity which they weren't ultimately funding in the beginning. It's been funded by people who are going first, and they want security of supply, but we can't necessarily guarantee that, can we?
So there is a recognition in terms of that provision that upgrades will be required. Again, I've had that discussion with Watercare recently, and they have provided to a certain capacity on the basis that there will be additional capacity required, not only because of existing occupiers, but also because Drury will be developed out, and as it's developed out, they will need to provide further infrastructure, and that will be paid for through IGCs.
And that will be provided to everyone, and that everyone will pay, and that everyone will have the supply when they demand it.
That would be the intention.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Cooper, please.
So I think you've covered it off in terms of, we'll be a significant submitter, and do we work with, for example, Watercare and AT just to make sure, they are taking this really seriously? I think that's really what I want to know, that we are going to be a good tranche of submitters as a council family.
Yeah, so, I set out at the beginning the number of parties from across both the Crown and the council family that have been involved in this process from the outset. And there, and that will continue. I think it was very important in this process that the Crown were a part of the negotiations with the developers for the reasons that Councillor Newman, amongst others, have raised in terms of that negotiating process. Having the Crown there beside the council is intended to add additional leverage in terms of those negotiations, and any discussions around infrastructure in particular that take place will involve all of the relevant parties, and including Crown agencies, and we will ensure that it's joined up. And there may be a situation, ideally I suppose, where some of the submissions may be changed, or the admissions may start at one point and they may change as those negotiations. Yep.
We take it. This is. I've got only Councillor Cashmore, Hills, and then myself all closed. So this is. It's moved and seconded, and we're taking questions and comments.
Sorry, okay. Well, for me is that, I mean, it's absolutely clear. Yes, it's good that the government have put some money in, but it's still about a 3-point-something billion shortfall, and that does worry me, as some of the other speakers, and particularly, you know, and I really acknowledge the huge amount of work that's been done here, but we have a lot of focus on huge infrastructure, gobs of money going into these areas, and we're missing out other areas. We've got live zones. I'm going to talk about the Northwest. We've got live zones in Huapai, Hobsonville, Red Hills, you know, 30, 40, 50,000 houses, and we just have the infrastructure, and particularly with transport, is just not there, and we're not having these kind of discussions at all. And so that does worry me. However, I mean, it's not our decision, and we can't direct the panel. Those decisions will be made. So I think a lot of this will pivot on our submissions, and I think that we have to be really mindful that if this is all zoned live, we're up for a huge amount of the costs, notwithstanding what other people pay. It's billions and billions of dollars, and we leave the rest of our region a bit underdone. And so, you know, I'm not supporting development, but it scares the hell out of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper, for reiterating that, and Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the team here and the work that you've done, John, Ian, David, who've met before, but thank you. I think your words were very wise. I'd also like to acknowledge Craig and the team behind you who did the structure planning work. Like, this isn't new. When I first got elected to the Franklin Local Board in 2010, I ran into the Stevenson's development, which is that industrial estate, which Craig McElroy talked about, was it yesterday, saying that is going to be the solution for a large chunk of the stormwater issues in the area to solve the floodplain stuff. That's critical to hold the water back up in these new artificial lakes. Won't go into the detail. But what we are developing here, it's not just houses on a hillside. We are creating a massive employment zone. And I think the employment figures here are slightly undercooked from what I've spoken to the people I know in my ward. You know, Stevenson's probably 5,000 to 6,000. Kiwi property with the retail is probably similar sort of number, at least 5. Charles Maher with his commercial and light retail on the other side is 4 to 5. Then there's developments coming forward in Pukekohe all around the racetrack, which are going to be employment centres and large employment centres. And then other big food producers and processors in the Franklin who are doubling and trebling and in some cases quadrupling their business plans right now. And some of them are underway, and these are multi-million, multi-billion-dollar private businesses growth all happening in that central Franklin area. So this is not going to be a commuting suburb. This is going to be a live, work, play area. Exactly what we aim for. It's going to be transport orientated for the train, so it is a part of a TOD. And the other thing, the other areas, the big growth areas, is around the airport for employment precinct, because the Highbrook and East Tamaki stuff's done. So that south area is going to become a financial and economic hub for the city, bigger of scale than anything else that we've currently got. And it is going to be the pinnacle of that Tauranga, Hamilton, Auckland, Golden Triangle that's going to be 50 to 60% of the population growth and 80 to 90% of the employment growth. And if we think we can stop population growth, well, go and stand at low tide and wait, because you can't. And you know, people have a right to come home from overseas. People have a right to come from the South Island to work in Auckland. We are privileged to live in a growth city that's vibrant, that's challenging, but it does have huge growth prospects. A lot of other places in this country don't, but we do. And we're privileged to help guide that. The work that this team have done, and Craig's done, and the planning team, is critical to give us that long-term outlook. Good on Phil Twyford for coming forward with the chequebook and saying he recognised the strategic importance of this area. And he helped fund Mill Road, which will supply the aggregate to build the rest of Auckland. That's what it all travels on. You won't get your cycleways, your bridges, your sky pass, anything, without that aggregate coming out of those 5 quarries down south. And that's what's it all about. And it's also about that economic performance and that growth. The questions have been great, and there are concerns. But I think Ian summed it up well. This is about how we sequence the timing and the delivery of the infrastructure so it arrives at the right point at the right time and we get the cost right. This is not going to all happen in the next 5 years. This is 20, 25 years worth of work that we're looking at here. And sure, we're staring at COVID right now and trying to emerge from a pretty deep recession. But that will change. And in a few years' time, CRL will be finished. That will be a game changer for the city. Skypath will be up and running. And this will be starting. And the airport precinct will be starting. It will be a different world. And it's a world I look forward to hopefully witnessing. So the support around the table today, with the reticence, I completely understand. Next month, there's some more coming through from Drury on the western side, which I'm looking forward to the team talking through the same degree of detail. And that stuff is actually in sequence, not out of sequence. So thank you for your inputs today. Thank you for your questions. However, the opportunity needs to be grasped, because to deny it is exactly being the King Canute standing at low tide, because it's coming whether you want it or not.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies, I was on council business, so missed the first part of the presentation, but I had read the report. I guess for me, I understand the need for the investment and the housing, and I do believe this looks like a better planned development that we've had in a long time because of the thought around jobs, growth, the people all living together, and there is balance there for investment in actual public transport, connecting those routes up. But it's still, to me, I won't be opposing it. We cannot oppose this plan change anyway. But I have serious concerns that it is still out of kilter with the unitary plan and the Auckland plan. It is, I think we're kidding ourselves that we'll have the budgets. We're always behind as a city. We're always well behind, and I don't know where the funding will come from. We are still waiting in suburbs that have been around for 20, 30 years for the infrastructure to catch up. To Councillor Cooper's point, that there may be a cycleway along the northwestern, but there's no good public transport for those people that we expect to live in a public transport world, but don't supply it because we can't, because we're constantly catching up. There is, Councillor Coombs, has been, spoke during the finance and performance discussion around cycleways that John Key basically funded, 5, 6 years ago, that we're still waiting for, that we haven't been able to get along. So it does make me nervous when things like Mill Road that were in ATAP in the last part, just stage 1 in the last part of the first 10 years, is now moved all 3 stages forward out of sync. And we didn't vote on that as a council for that to happen in that way. So I guess I have nervousness over time that developers or great plans that in their isolation seem fantastic kind of bounce around the long-term planning of our city. And although there are jobs and everything in here, that is not how Auckland is. That's not how people live. So people will move to a place. We see it all around our city, even if there is jobs in the area, we all switch around. If you look at Stats New Zealand, it's around 30% of all suburbs stay within their suburb for their job, even when the jobs are there. Everyone switches around. And we know the southern motorways are, terribly, terribly clogged, the worst probably in the city. So I have serious concerns for climate change planning funding, that we're kidding ourselves that this will work. That I don't believe it can work unless we have some major change in the way we're funding things, or a major increase in taxes and rates that maybe are unpalatable, because we're always behind, and we're still behind. I do worry about the climate change impacts of this. It's very clear that it will create far higher emissions when we've all promised. We've voted unanimously to cut emissions by half in 10 years' time when a lot of this development comes on stream. So, yeah, I'm very conflicted. People need a place to live, but we also need to intensify faster and provide public transport, not just train stations, but cross throughout suburbs, that suburbs are waiting now. So it feels very awkward supporting this, because I know the intent, I know the neighbourhoods, I know that people need and want that investment, but I just don't know how the overall Auckland picture looks if we keep making these constant mistakes, in my opinion, that we hope the infrastructure comes and then we leave people out in the middle of nowhere before it gets built. So yeah, I'm very conflicted, so thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. So look, our job here is to undertake a course view, a course assessment. It's not a merits-based. There's really no opportunity to treat this as a resource consent, so that gets struck out. And really the only real opportunity for rejecting this is on sound resource management practice grounds, and I have not heard any arguments in that area brought forward today. I have heard very strong arguments and good feedback from every person that is a member of this committee that's raised a question or made a comment emphasising the infrastructure funding challenges. And that is being recorded. And I think it's consistent right across all of the speakers here today. It is consistent. The plan changes, plural, 3 of them are consistent absolutely with the very thorough structure planning that's occurred there. And of course we know about the 2.4 billion that's coming from central government. I probably just do want to note that in discussions with the Minister, he has always emphasised that this is a public transport and active transport-led development area. It is not something that comes later. It is led by public transport primarily and active. I do note, though, that we had no understanding of the complementary transport requirements for this area when we put our hands up for the 2.4. So a bit of a lesson there that we need, while it's good to be spoon-fed big money, we need to understand what the tags are. So next time that comes along for us, and hopefully there will be a next time, we need to understand what has to give, possibly, or what needs to be put in place to pay for the complementary works. And that is the challenge with these plan changes. So we can see that a lot of that is going to be progressed and discussed at the hearing with Auckland Transport's support, with our submission, which is signalled. Members, I don't think there is, it's not right to adopt this. It's not right to reject it. I'm recommending, as you can see by my move, that we accept it. Noting AT will submit, will be there as well, a tremendous amount of work that I'm not aware that, we've gone to this level of thoroughness in previous plan changes, and I think that will be continued as we head towards the hearing, emphasising those enormous funding challenges. We're definitely not flying blind here. We are very well informed to lend our vote of support for accepting these private plan changes. So now I'll put this to the vote. It is moved and seconded with the addition of the B and the C. I'm just mindful of any members online. If we have missed you in fetching your questions or your comments, please let the staff know in the sidebar. I'll proceed to put this to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Thank you, members. That is carried. Members will now go